Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with David Robson, who is a, prolific journalist. Used to be an editor at New Scientist, which is one of my favorite publications for a long time, and also the author of a couple books. The most recent book is called The Expectation Effect: How Your Mindset Can Change Your World. And this was preceded not too long ago by this book called The Intelligence Trap: Revolutionize Your Thinking and Make Wiser Decisions. Welcome, David.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on the show. I should just say I've also got another book that's come out even more recently, which is called The Laws of Connection. But yes, I'm happy to talk about, all three books, two books, whichever you prefer.
Well, okay, that's not really very fair because, I try to make sure I've read all the books before I have them. So,
right, sorry.
We can just reschedule and do this another day, or I'm going to, see what I can do not having read that.
I'm happy to talk about the first two. I don't have to talk about the last one if you...
Well, I'm going to read it either way because I have to say that both of these books for me are like intellectual catnip. I just love reading this sort of material because it is at once descriptive and prescriptive, right? It does a good job of explaining what we know about how we think, but it also provides us with some guidance, right? And sometimes the guidance is familiar and sometimes it is presented in a novel way, which enables you to re-examine and rethink how you think and how you interact with the world. So even for people who are familiar with some of the themes and some of the sources, it's always good, I find, to look at someone else's perspective on the material, and yours is quite fruitful. So maybe we can start by maybe we'll go in chronological order and we'll talk about the intelligence trap first, because I think the key thesis in this book is that intelligence doesn't seem to be correlated with, I guess, the things that we want to have intelligence for, right? I mean, the reason why we think intelligence is a good thing is because it is supposed to help us make better decisions. It's supposed to help us, be more successful, and it's supposed to help us perhaps have a better sense of well-being. And while we've seen an increased intelligence, right, the Flynn effect occur in almost every society in recent times, it doesn't mean that we've created people who are better decision makers, right, or wiser. And then if we look at it sort of cross-sectionally, sometimes the people who are the smartest and have the highest IQ, they're also not necessarily the people who have the most practical wisdom or are the most successful. So I guess we got to discuss why that's the case, but we also have to discuss why people don't seem to understand that that's the case and why we have such an emphasis on this narrowly defined set of competencies that we call IQ.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the history of IQ, it shouldn't be surprising that it's missing a lot of what we should consider to be important for kind of smart or wise living, because its origins were in France at the fin de siècle, when they were really trying to work out, how they could provide an equal education to everyone. And one of the requirements was that schools could identify who was falling behind and needed a bit of extra help in getting to the same level as the other kids. And so these researchers, Binet was the main one, he came up with this set of questions that would just help to find, how children in each year compared, and also then how they compared to people older or younger than themselves. Now, that was then adopted in the US by this psychologist called Lewis Terman, who came up with this way of calculating the quotient, which was the comparison between someone's mental age and their chronological age. And, that did show that did show amazing success at predicting people's academic credentials, which is exactly what it was designed to do. The problem was that somewhere along the way, we started to think, and Terman was guilty of this more than anyone really, we started to think that that number would predict people's decision making and rationality, outside of education, that it would actually come to determine the whole of their life. And what the new research shows is that that just isn't true. So you can have these special tests of things like critical thinking, rationality, susceptibility to biases. There's even now new tests of wise reasoning. So looking at how intellectually humble people are, how easily they find it to come to a compromise with another person, consider their perspectives. We can look at all of these different aspects of thinking that should be really important. And what you see is that there's actually a very, in lots of cases, there's a very low correlation with IQ. Or the proxies we use for IQ, so things like the SAT scores, or in the UK, our kind of end of school exams. And so clearly, that should be telling us that we need to not just measure these other traits and abilities, but we should actually be trying to cultivate them in the same way that we have been very good at cultivating the kind of intelligence that is measured by IQ. Now, my opinion when I wrote The Intelligence Trap, and it remains the same today, is that we haven't made as much progress as we could have done. So there's a long way to go as a society to make sure that we are making the most of the intelligence that we have.
Now, the tests for these other forms of intelligence, it seems like they're a little bit harder to administer, right? So, you had some samples of the kinds of questions that are contained in some of these other tests. And it seems like they require a human to kind of, I'm wondering if you can use new forms of machine learning to grade these things, but it does seem like it's kind of harder to measure in some standardized way.
It is in some cases. In others, I think you can have these standardized tests. So Keith Stanovich, who is a Canadian psychologist who led a lot of the work on measuring rationality, he has come up with what he calls colloquially the rationality quotient that looks at our susceptibility to cognitive biases. And he has designed those questions in a way that actually you can have standardized scores. They can be rolled out in education or the workplace to look at, a range of people's kind of logical thinking and ability to appraise different pieces of evidence, their statistical thinking, all of this. So I think there is, that's very encouraging, actually, that has been developed and that, it could be used very broadly, I think. In others, you're right, though. So the tests of wise reasoning often ask people to kind of talk out loud about a particular topic. So it might be about a news story. It could be about what we call an advice column from a newspaper, the dilemma that's been presented to an advice columnist. And then the participant has to describe how they think you could solve the problem. And then those answers are coded by psychologists who can rate them on these various aspects of wisdom, such as intellectual humility, consideration of different perspectives. Now, I can see why that isn't so easy to roll out on the kind of, in the broader kind of educational system that we currently have. But I think you're right that actually, artificial intelligence might soon remove some of those errors. And actually, I've been talking to that researcher, Igor Grossman, about the potential to use AI in the measurement of wisdom and also in the training of wisdom. And he's very optimistic that these tools can be useful.
Yeah, I mean, I do not understand why our schools, I teach in an MBA program, and I would love it if we would use these sorts of tests to screen for applicants. And at the very least, if we would use these tests, maybe at the beginning and then at the end of the program, to see if we actually add any value, right? Because, these things are teachable and coachable. And it does seem like these other types of intelligence are even more teachable and coachable than what we might think of as, general intelligence. I mean, is that true? Do you think? I mean, otherwise, I don't think you would have written this book if you didn't think that, right? I mean, it's hard to write a book saying like, here's how you improve your IQ. That's tough. But I think, you're trying to say, here's how you can improve your wisdom and your, rational quota, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely agree with you. And, I wouldn't have written the book if I felt like I was just describing this terrible situation that couldn't be remedied. But there's loads of research showing that we can train things like critical thinking that are going to help people to score better on these tests. You can learn about your cognitive biases, and that awareness can help you to be less susceptible to them. You can learn how to appraise different pieces of evidence in a more even-handed way. There's a bunch of different cognitive techniques that we can do to make sure that we don't fall for biases like the my-side bias, or confirmation bias, as it's also called. One of those techniques is called consider the opposite, and it's just this the idea that whatever piece of evidence that you're presented with, you ask first of all how you would appraise the quality of the information it contains if the conclusion was different from the one that it's come to. So, in politics, if you're a Republican and you're reading an economic report on the Republican economy, you ask yourself, well, would I believe this report if it actually concluded that the Democrats had the better economic policy? So, it's that kind of situation where our biases can be very strong. We have this kind of gravitational pull of our political identity that kind of warps all of our reasoning around a topic. But considering the opposite really does seem to be very effective at actually reducing those biases, those tendencies. And we can teach those in schools, and we should be teaching them. It should be, I think, part of, say, the history curriculum to teach people about how things like confirmation bias have contributed to events in the past, and then to teach students how they can avoid it themselves.
Well, I think for some people it's second nature. I mean, before I even, gotten through the third word of any claim, I'm already thinking about what's wrong with the claim. But, that's something I've been doing since a very young age. And you talk about Ben Franklin and how, he's kind of a model for this. And he learned to do this through an early exposure to Plato, right? And so in a way, I mean, what you're describing is philosophy as distinct from, I guess, scientific knowledge. I mean, adding a layer of philosophy on top of the approaches to knowledge that are, I guess, less philosophical. But I wanted to, I mean, your book, it goes far, makes a broader claim, which is not that these different intelligence exist in different realms, and that they're completely uncorrelated, but you say that sometimes, right, people make bad decisions and have less of this practical wisdom, not in spite of their intelligence, but because of their intelligence. Right. And that sometimes being more intelligent, you talk about Nobel disease, being more intelligent in the standard way can make you kind of, less rational or less capable in these other domains.
Yeah, I mean, that was the bold claim of my book, and I stand by it. And, like you mentioned Nobel disease, and that's a very, very common phenomenon that once someone's won a Nobel Prize, they start to have crazy ideas often that are not supported by the evidence. And, I give the example of Carey Mullis, who discovered the polymerase chain reaction. So we all know now how important that's been in medical testing. But he had crazy ideas about the paranormal. He absolutely denied the connection between HIV and AIDS, even when it was completely the scientific consensus. He denied that CFCs were causing the hole in the ozone layer. He was wrong more than he was right, essentially. And that was the inspiration for my book. Actually, it was to understand how this would be possible. Now, talking of the philosophical precedents to some of these ideas. Well, we do see that you can go back to Descartes, for example, who said that often the problem is that people are simply, their intelligence is driving them too quickly down the wrong road, and you'd actually do much better to be a slower thinker, but to make sure that you're walking down the right road than to go off on this diversion. And that's also what a lot of the psychologists told me. They compared intelligence to the engine of a car, but that's no good if you don't also have very robust steering, a GPS system or a map to help guide your route. Otherwise, that incredibly fast engine can just drive you off a cliff. And I think it's a very apposite comparison, because when we measure something like IQ, it does seem to be related to the efficiency of the brain's networks in some way. So it is helping the brain to process information more quickly, which can be a big advantage when you're learning something new and complex, or when you have to make very rapid decisions. But what it doesn't protect you from is the things that we spoke about. So all of those biases. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're any more likely to consider a piece of evidence fairly, rather than just allowing your preconceptions to cloud your judgment. And the big problem is that once you have made those mistakes, you then have your intelligence to rationalize and justify the conclusion that you've come to. That's a process called motivated reasoning, and I think that's really behind this idea of the intelligence trap.
Yeah, I mean, in my personal experience, and this is anecdotal, and I'm always suspicious of my subjective impressions, but over the years, I've found that it is kind of more difficult to stimulate a conversation in the classroom where there is disagreement, whether real or even simulated. Difficult to get people to, have multiple perspectives in their brain simultaneously that they can compare and contrast. And so I always wondered, well, is that because the quality of the student is going down? And of course, the admissions people tell me that the GMAT scores just keep getting higher and higher. So, I'm wondering if maybe, that's the problem. Maybe we need to kind of go and find some people that are a little less smart, because they kind of outsmart themselves. And, we talk a lot about the Dunning-Kruger effect, and how it's the ignorant people that are the most overconfident. But that doesn't seem to always be true, right? I mean, sometimes the overconfidence is greatest among the people who have sort of the most knowledge in a particular domain.
Yeah, I mean, and that's related to the motivated reasoning that I described, but there's also this phenomenon called earned dogmatism. And so, if you've always been scoring really well in education and you're very highly qualified, that can give you this perception that your judgment is kind of infallible. You've got your credentials, so you don't actually have to consider all of the evidence as carefully as someone who's got fewer credentials, because you kind of know it all anyway. And that is a phenomenon that has been demonstrated in scientific studies, and it's a real danger. Even if it were true that at the time that you got your qualifications, you kind of knew everything there was to know about a particular topic, the world's just changing so quickly that knowledge needs to be updated. We need to always be open to new pieces of evidence that might completely change our point of view. And if we aren't doing that, if we're closed-minded, that is going to lead us into these intellectual pitfalls that then, I think they're damaging the quality of the discourse, like you mentioned. They can also be very damaging for our own personal lives.
Well, I mean, is there a style of education that is more likely to create people with this type of wisdom? I mean, I recently gave a talk where I was talking in praise of the Montessori method, right? Which, in my experience, stimulates curiosity and self-directed learning. I mean, are we getting education wrong? Are we doing something in our educational system that um, discourages this type of curiosity?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are. And so I obviously know the English education system best, but I think we're often rewarded, in lots of different disciplines for kind of creating a convincing argument. And you might kind of pay lip service to the points of view that oppose your argument, but really, you know, you're kind of doing that to then be able to kind of find the kind of hole in that line of thinking that will bring you back to your line of argument. So it's, persuasion seems to be very important in a lot of the um, academic disciplines that, that I'm familiar with. And it's, so we're actually training people essentially in motivated reasoning to a certain extent, which is unfortunate. But what I've been really encouraged by is when you look at education programs that have just tried to incorporate elements of critical thinking into the standard syllabus. So, you might be teaching students history, but you're also getting them to practice their critical thinking skills much more rigorously. It's much more, it's incorporated much more thoroughly into the curriculum, where the knowledge of logical fallacies, for example, and all of these strategies you can use to try to overcome your own biases. And you might think, well, that comes as a distraction from the kind of rigor of the primary academic subject that you're studying. But actually, the research shows that the opposite is true. The kids that come out of those courses, they don't just do better on measures of critical thinking, for example. They also actually end up learning more about the original disciplines. So they know more about the historical facts. And I think it's just because it's a much more engaging way of looking at the material if you can actually, interrogate it in this way. And if you know that that interrogation is going to help you throughout life, that you're learning these skills that are going to be essential to stop you falling for some kind of scam or to help you make a smarter choice when you're considering who to vote for.
Well, you also pointed to some studies that showed a correlation between critical thinking and longevity and happiness. And is this just because you're less likely to make stupid decisions, or is there something else to it? Because one would think that the people who have the most certainty would be the people who could have the least amount of stress in their lives, right? They would be relaxed and go to bed assured that they knew what they needed to know. And it's the people who had sort of more precarious or a less certain understanding of the world, that those are the people who would be losing sleep at night, and would be subject to the kind of stress that would reduce their life expectancy.
Well, I mean, I think there are merits to that argument, but I mean, one of my favorite studies looked at critical thinking scores and compared them to, they had this kind of inventory of all of these like terrible outcomes, like things that can happen in your life. So it wasn't, obviously it's not comprehensive, but there are about 60 items, and it ranged from stuff that we know is pretty bad for us, like getting sunburnt, having unprotected sex, and it went right through to being arrested, going bankrupt, going to jail. And what you found is that the people with better critical thinking skills were just much less likely to have those negative outcomes in their lives. And, if you think of the cumulative stress of making just bad decision after bad decision, I think that is going to have an impact on your overall longevity. Not to mention, when you're not taking care of your health because you're not listening to the advice of the medical establishment and you're instead, choosing to shun vaccines or to follow some kind of weird fad diet. So I think that's, to me, is where the link lies. And the best example that I could find was this physicist Paul Frampton, who many people thought
Yeah.
was in the running for a Nobel Prize.
I feel terrible for this guy.
you know, um, Me too. But I think it is instructive, actually. I do. I mean, I feel really sorry for him,
This is the
and
guy who
I hope he's.
this is the guy
Yeah.
who fell for a like a romantic scam and wound up smuggling drugs,
Right.
right, into the U.S. from Argentina or
Yeah,
Bolivia
yeah. It
or
was a
something
honey
like
trap
that.
scam.
Yeah.
Yeah, these people. He was single. He was, you know, kind of a senior. He was over 60 and was trying to, uh, you know, find love again after a divorce. And so these scammers found this picture of this beautiful model, started chatting to him for months over instant messenger, and then this persona invited him to La Paz, Bolivia, where they were gonna meet up. She didn't turn up, but said she'd had to go to another modeling shoot, but had left her suitcase in the hotel. Could he bring it to their next meeting? And he did, but he was stopped at the airport because it was lined with, I think, 2 kilograms of cocaine. Now, what was interesting there was, his friends were telling him, just do not do this. Like, it's obviously a scam. Like, be careful. And he just didn't listen to them.
Hmm.
So, and then he spent time in prison for this. And I think it's a very extreme example, but I think we can learn a lot from that because, even if we're just falling for kind of, smaller scams, like, believing in, you know, fad diets, even, like, it's, over the long term, it is damaging our health, it's damaging our life. And so that's why we really need critical thinking to be something that we apply automatically.
Hmm. Yeah, I have a colleague that fell for some, crypto scam, and he's got an incredible amount of expertise. And I was just like, I don't know how that's even possible, right?
Yeah.
But you also talk about how learning happens when people are struggling a bit, right? And I used to have this
Mm.
professor who told me that confusion was 90% of the way to wisdom, and I think that's true, but it's only true if people believe, right, that the struggle is worth it, right? And this sort of gets to your second book, where the the beliefs that you have will impact all sorts of things, right? So if you believe that this struggle means that you are stupid and that you will fail, then the struggle will actually be counterproductive. But if you believe that the struggle is a necessary part of the learning and that you will ultimately kind of make your way through it, then it will be a better path for you, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think I mean, it's a huge bias that we have, or erroneous belief that we have, that when we're frustrated, then that's a sign that something is going wrong. But actually, so many intellectual leaps happen when we are frustrated. It's actually just a sign that your brain is grappling with this material on a deeper level. And so, like you say, we have the desirable difficulties in education. So actually, we learn more and we are more creative when we're struggling, but we just don't appreciate that fact enough. So that's, I would say, like, is an example of an expectation effect, which more generally is just describing the ways that our beliefs can create self-fulfilling prophecies, and that can be through perceptions, behavior, or through changes to our physiology.
Right now, so the expectation effect happens in a lot of different ways. The most well known, I think, is the placebo effect. And I think a lot of people would say that the placebo effect is primarily a conditioned response, right? So if you have experienced some effect in the past, right? So you drink alcohol and you get drunk. Then if I give you some fake alcohol, you'll experience the symptoms of drunkenness, or caffeine. I mean, I remember one time I worked in a restaurant, and when they didn't have decaf coffee, they told the wait staff, just tell everybody it's decaf. I did not approve, but apparently there were no ill effects because people believed it was decaf. So I mean that's sort of like a conditioned response, and that conditioned response would sort of decay over time, presumably, if your body started to realize that hey, wait a second, I'm not getting the thing that I thought I was getting. But it's far bigger than that, right? There's the sort of stress reduction that happens when you believe that you are sort of being taken care of and that you're safe and so forth. I mean, there's much more to the placebo effect than simply the conditioned response to a chemical or a stimulus, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it really does work on multiple levels. So you're right. There in lots of cases, we do have this process of conditioning. So if you've been receiving opioid drugs in the past, and then you're given a pill or an injection that, seems to be identical to the one that you're expecting to receive, then, the brain does start to produce its own endogenous opioids that will have their own equally powerful analgesic effect. And actually, we know, with opioids in particular, that the placebo effect can be roughly equivalent to the actual effect of the drug. So there was this beautiful experiment where doctors either gave the injection kind of overtly in front of the patient and, accompanied that with a few words, or they did it surreptitiously. It was just added to the patient's drip. And the pain relief was about twice as big when the patient knew that they were receiving the drug, when the doctor had done it right in front of them. Brain scans, various experiments can show that it is indeed the actions of the opioids themselves. So, I do think that is conditioning. Doesn't mean that we still can't use it to our advantage. So, for example, you can reduce the doses of the active ingredient that people are receiving through this conditioning. So with painkillers, for example, you can, even if it's an open label placebo, so that's a placebo that people, they know they're receiving the placebo. Through this process of conditioning, you can get them to take the placebo pills the majority of the time and only kind of top it up occasionally with the real drug, which is obviously a much healthier way to be receiving your pain relief, and then much easier to kind of wean yourself off of the drug overall once you've recovered from that injury or operation. But you're right that there's other things like stress that come into this too, and that can be equally powerful for recovery.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about this one athlete that used performance-enhancing drugs when they were not competing, and they learned that this improved their performance, and then their medical practitioner withdrew the stuff in time for the competition, but didn't tell the athlete. The athlete thought he was getting the performance-enhancing drug, but and so that's clearly conditioning. But I think you make the point that you don't actually ever need to provide the initial training if people have a belief system, right? So if people believe that opiates are a powerful pain reducer, then you can give them some sham opiates and it will have the effect. But there has to be this belief that there is this relationship. So if you gave sham opiates to somebody who had never heard of opiates, it probably wouldn't have the same effect, right?
Right, exactly. So yeah, you do, people need quite detailed information. But what I found very encouraging with the when I was researching the expectation effect was the fact that people often respond really well just to being educated about the mind-body connection. So actually just being taught that your brain can produce its own analgesics, that in itself can be very empowering and can help people to manage their pain better. So, you tell them that and then you give them these placebo pills. They don't have to be conditioned, but they will still receive some kind of benefit from the ritual of receiving the pill combined with that information. So I think, it's powerful, and there are lots of other ways that people are being, that doctors are now applying the principles of the placebo effect, but in these ways that are not deceptive. So giving people who've gone through a difficult operation some psychological therapy to kind of explain the benefits of the surgery. So, mechanically, what was going on when the surgeon, changed the plumbing of the heart, for example. And then talking through some of their concerns. So you're reducing their anxiety and setting a positive recovery plan. So something that's totally realistic. You're not misleading them for what they can achieve, but you're just helping them to realize what they might expect their body to be able to do at a certain point. And what the research showed there, no deception at all. But these patients left hospital a few days early, which is quite profound because that in itself easily met the cost of this psychological therapy. Hospital beds are very expensive to to maintain. And then these people return to work more quickly. They return to their daily activities more quickly. And you could see that this was correlated with differences in the inflammation within the body. So you could give them blood tests, you can look for these inflammatory markers, and they were lower. And that probably aided their healing as well. It probably, it was, really, I think, a combination of perception, behavior, and physiology all in one. And it was very powerful.
Yeah, it's kind of puzzling why the medical system doesn't incorporate more of these insights. Now, I used to think it was because, we had shifted from an ethic of, do no harm and help to one of informed consent. And so that sort of, eliminated the use of placebos. But that doesn't really explain it. I mean, if what you're saying is true, which is that there are these other ways that you can induce healing that don't involve, say, pharmaceuticals or, medical devices, but that just require maybe some education about what's happening and perhaps a sense of care and a sense of comfort and a sense that, there are people that have mean well for you, right? And so forth, and that you're safe and that, you are expected to recover. I think that has been sacrificed by economics, right? I mean, the typical doctor will spend 7 minutes with each patient, and they'll do the operation and be like, all right, you're done, boom, get out of here, right? But it's like, you probably don't even need to have doctors do that, right? You just need somebody in a white lab coat who, looks like a doctor, right? As long as they had the right script and they had, I guess, an empathic demeanor, you'd probably be able to get a lot of those results, right?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So I think there's, a real combination of potential strategies that could be used. I do think in some cases, talking to a health psychologist within a hospital, for example, that might be a good way forward rather than getting the surgeon himself to kind of go through this process. In other cases, I just think it's the way that a doctor is delivering the information. So one of my favorite studies looked at people who had turned up at their family doctor with a viral infection that, couldn't really be treated. So in some ways you might think, well, it was a wasted visit, but the visit was going to basically take the same time, whatever. And when the doctors were more compassionate and empathetic about the symptoms, but also more reassuring, and just gave them, explained to them how the body was going to fight that virus without the need for any additional drugs. Those people recovered more quickly, and you could see the difference in like the inflammation within their nose, like their immune system was just responding a bit more effectively. So the doctor's words were biologically active. That's how I see it, and it didn't really cost anything for the doctor to provide that little bit extra reassurance. We saw the same. There was a great study looking at people receiving an infusion of iron to deal with anemia, and just explaining to them, again, the mechanics, the biology of why this was going to help them to regain their energy levels had a tremendous impact on the amount of relief that they felt and how long the effects of that actually lasted in their lives. so that's a potentially saving money in that it's, you maybe these patients would need fewer of these infusions if they received it with the accompanying information. I just find it so exciting, but I think medicine is kind of relatively slow to kind of respond to new approaches in certain cases. But actually, I was really delighted by how many doctors have been in touch with me after reading The Expectation Effect. And, they're saying that they are already applying it themselves, that they don't need a push from a medical authority to tell them that they have to do this. Like, they're just taking it into their own hands.
Yeah, I mean, because a lot of people are puzzled by why it is the case that, particularly in America, the amount that we spend on healthcare just keeps going up and up and up without the health actually, getting any better. And it seems that part of it has to do with these non-pharmacological aspects, right? Where people are. They don't feel like they're being cared for. They don't feel like they are safe, right? And some of this has to do with the medical system and how medicine is delivered, but part of it has to do with, right, the society in which they live and the expectations they have. And we've seen we saw this huge rise in the use of opiates, and some people have said it's because people are experiencing the pain of social rejection and so forth. And you talk about pain and pain management, and you say that there were in the various world wars situations where they had no opiates, and yet the patients were able to manage the pain simply because they were assured that they would get through this. And I think knowing that pain is going to end makes the pain bearable, but believing that the pain might be ongoing forever makes it unbearable.
Yeah, I mean that's that's it. Pain is definitely modulated by our psychology, which can affect the perception of the pain, but also the physiology. And actually, in those cases, like with I think he was called Henry Beecher in the Second World War, he also just said the euphoria of being retrieved by your own side, who were and being taken to safety. We know euphoria is accompanied by the release of these endorphins, which are natural painkillers, and that was often enough. So, like you say, it's that expectation and the feeling of safety that is so important. And so, this is also why there's a movement now to give people cognitive behavioral therapy to deal with pain, especially chronic pain, because we do know that changing people's mindsets about their pain can be clinically can bring about significant benefits. And the key thing here seems to be that if you've got this kind of ruminative, catastrophic thinking about your pain, like you're very scared of the pain because you think that it's only going to get worse and worse and worse, and you feel that it's never going to end, and you start imagining the kind of biological damage that it might be reflecting. What that does, that anxiety actually causes the release of this chemical called CCK, which amplifies pain signals that come from the body to the brain. So it's like really, one of the researchers says it's like pouring gasoline on the flames. I think of it as being like turning up the volume. It's your body is and your brain are responding because the anxiety, combined with the anxiety, it really wants you to get to safety, but you're also telling yourself there's no safe place to go. And so that's why we do need to have this kind of cognitive shift in the way we look at the pain to try to get that process under control again.
So, I mean, sometimes stimulating an awareness of a problem can make the problem worse, right? So, there was this movement in 1999, 2000 to, make people more aware of pain, and pain became like one of the key metrics that doctors, would look at. And so by kind of stimulating an awareness of the real pain that people had, it seems to have backfired in a way, created more pain. And I think the same thing is true with other social pathologies, right? As we become more aware of the harmful effects of racism and sexism, we start to see it everywhere, right? And so, I think if you go into a social encounter expecting, whether it be rejection or expecting hostility or expecting some kind of discrimination, you're more likely to perceive it, whether it's there or not, right? And of course, the flip side is true. If
Yeah,
you
I
go
mean, I
into an
think
encounter,
that
if you go into an
is,
encounter expecting warmth and expecting, friendliness and objectivity, you're more likely to perceive that, right?
yeah, I mean, that's definitely true. So, from the research I did for the expectation effect, there's very good studies showing that, when someone is already feeling quite vulnerable, they're much more likely to notice all of the kind of frowning faces in a crowd. So they're kind of looking for the hostility without meaning to, but it's much more salient to them. And what's especially interesting to me is that they're more likely to perceive very neutral faces as being kind of angry or hostile. So, you know, their expectations are actually shaping their perception. It's changing attention and perception. And that can then perpetuate this cycle and make people, it's part of having something like depression or anxiety is often these
Mm.
perceptual and attentional shifts that are reinforcing the feelings of fear or sadness or helplessness that you're already experiencing.
Right. And so when it comes to mental health, right, we all know cognitive behavioral therapy can be very effective. And so what are the key things there? I mean, is it learned optimism, fake it till you make it, right? I mean, my understanding of how SSRIs work is that they simply kind of change the trajectory of your learning when you encounter the world and make you more likely to spot the kind of positive information that you would previously be likely to ignore, right? So it doesn't actually lead to any kind of deceptive relationship with the world. It just kind of changes the way you learn from the data you see in the world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's definitely one of the effects of SSRIs, is that it kind of corrects these negativity biases that we have. And that's one reason why they might not relieve your symptoms immediately, because it takes a while for that kind of shift in bias to actually create a long-lasting change in the way that you're perceiving the world. You have to kind of relearn how to see the world in a less negative light. But it could be that SSRIs are working through multiple mechanisms. So there's also some research suggesting that they increase neuroplasticity, which may be related to that, but it could also be why it's often beneficial to combine SSRIs with cognitive behavioral therapy that's kind of teaching people how to reappraise those biases through talking therapy. And so if you have this increased neuroplasticity, you're probably going to find that learning process easier, essentially. When writing the expectation effect, I was kind of quite careful to not encourage a kind of toxic positivity that might be a danger with this kind of science.
Well, it would
In that,
seem to
what I'm not
conflict with
saying someone who's experiencing.
it would seem to conflict with the sort of wisdom that you're preaching in the other book, right? Which is to
Right,
have the
yeah,
capacity to see
absolutely.
both sides. So if you find yourself getting too optimistic, you got to be like, hey, wait a second, let's have a reality check here.
Yeah, and that's exactly how I see it. I think a reality check is a great phrase to use, actually, because Um, so I think a lot of us are reflexively pessimistic in our lives because we kind of think, you expect the worst, and then anything that's better than that will bring you joy. But actually, by expecting the worst through these expectation effects, you might actually be bringing about the worst. It could actually be changing the outcome so that a positive outcome is less likely. So being pessimistic is not rational. Like it's not as smart as we think it's going to be. But I'm not saying we should be like Pollyanna and just, try to pretend that all of these difficulties in our lives don't exist. I think we need to be in that sweet middle ground where we're remaining open-minded to all of the possibilities. So if you take something like stress in our lives, for example, some stresses are just like undesirable. Through therapy, you might be able to find some way of reappraising them, but I'm not going to tell someone who's going through grief that there's anything good coming out of that. But lots of the stresses we have are actually part of positive growth, really. So, when I have to do public speaking, in the past, it was something I absolutely hated. Like, I felt terrible doing it, but it was part of my professional development. It was a way of me communicating what I had learned to a large audience. And actually, it was stressful, but it was also a little bit exhilarating as well. And so I was, by writing The Expectation Effect, I learned to reappraise that stress and kind of reappreciate why it was exciting and exhilarating. And part of that was recognizing that the uncertainty of being on stage is actually what makes it scary, but also what makes it exciting. And to recognize that it could go badly, but there's every chance that it could also go well. You might have a difficult question or a bad response, but you might also have some new kind of connection with the audience, or someone might prompt you to think about the topic in a completely new way. So that's the kind of reappraisal that I'm talking about, is to recognize how things like stress can actually be enhancing rather than debilitating. And we don't always have to catastrophize things that feel uncomfortable, because sometimes the discomfort is part of what makes them so powerful.
Yeah, I know. If we teach people that discomfort is threatening, then it will in fact reduce their performance. And you said that if you teach people that discomfort is a good thing, that their performance actually improves, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, wonderful experiments from the University of Rochester, for example, in the US, that had looked at people taking difficult graduate exams. And, especially like the math part of these exams is it causes a lot of anxiety for lots of people. But in some practice exams, the researchers had just left this short text that explained that actually the anxiety you're feeling might be uncomfortable, but it might also bring about a benefit, because we evolved the stress response to help us to respond to challenges. So when your heart is racing, it's pumping a lot of oxygen to your brain, which is actually helping you to think better. Cortisol, which is causing you to feel kind of jangly, well, that's keeping you alert, and you don't want to be sleepy in an exam. What they found was that it didn't really stop people feeling anxious. Like, they were still going to feel anxious, but they weren't catastrophizing that anxiety. And instead, they saw it as a resource that was useful to them. And that helped them to perform better. They actually performed better, and especially on the math part of the exam that was so terrifying beforehand.
Now, I interviewed Ellen Langer, so we talked a lot about some of the health consequences of different ways of thinking. But the chapter that you had on diet, I found absolutely fascinating, right? Which was that if you believe that a food is fattening, right, then your metabolism actually is going to be different than if you believe that it is sort of, low fat, low calorie, right? So you can take the exact same food with the exact same caloric and nutritional content, and depending on your perception. So by all these people who are running out and saying, I'm going to pursue the diet food, I'm going to pursue the light, low calorie this and low calorie that, what they're doing is they're actually altering their metabolism and their processing of the food itself to make them, hungrier. It kind of stimulates this scarcity feeling in their body. I mean, this is remarkable. So what we need to do is we need to basically market all of our diet food as being non-diet food. That's how we're going to wind up
Right.
getting people to lose weight, right?
Right. I mean, yeah, and I think like you've touched on a really big problem in the way that we market diet foods, which is that they provoke the scarcity mindset because the marketing is often all about the things that they're lacking.
Uh-huh.
They're kind of promoted as being sensible, low calorie, no sugar, no fat. There's nothing in the marketing that talks about the quality of the ingredients or
Hmm.
how delicious it is or how full you're going to feel afterwards. And what the research shows is that, it's those kinds of words, that kind of priming that we want if we want to feel more satisfied after we've eaten. So if we want our satiety to be higher after we've eaten some food, and that's completely missing with the diet foods. What this research had shown is that you can just shift the way you talk about these foods, and suddenly they are more appealing, they are more satisfying. So you can just emphasize the sensory qualities, and again, it changes physiology, so it changes levels of things like the hormone ghrelin, which we tend to have at high levels when we feel scarcity. So it's the hunger hormone because it's telling us to go and seek food. And so, when you emphasize those sensory qualities, ghrelin does drop after you've eaten. But it also changes our behavior. So there was a study looking at people's responses to slices of chocolate cake, depending on the labeling. And if you guided people to think about how delicious it was going to be to eat that cake, like how moist it was going to be, how strong the flavor was going to be, they were actually willing to pay more money for a smaller slice because
Hmm.
they realized that they were probably going to feel all the satisfaction they wanted by consuming less. So it's a win for the consumer because they're not kind of piling on the pounds having had this indulgence. And it's a win for the companies as well because they're actually increasing their profit margins by marketing their foods in that way.
But I think that the companies also benefit by labeling everything as low calorie and diet, because when people eat it, they
Right.
they don't feel satisfied, so then they go buy more, and then they're still fat, and so then they're like, I got to double down and eat even more of this stuff, and so it just keeps them in this like trapped in this cycle. Um, but what I find interesting is
I
you
mean,
seem
that
to
is very
say,
true.
yeah, but you seem to say that knowledge of the placebo effect allows it to work. It doesn't eliminate the placebo effect, but knowledge
Mm.
of the nocebo effect can reduce the nocebo effect. So why would that be the case? That doesn't seem symmetric. That knowledge of the placebo effect doesn't necessarily eliminate it, but knowledge of the nocebo effect can lead to its reduction in impact.
Yeah, so I mean, it does seem like a paradox, but actually, so I think you have to really look at the thought processes that go into that. So learn about the placebo effect. You realize that your brain has this amazing ability to kind of reduce its pain, for example, and tamp down on, reduce those signals, turn the volume down on those signals, produce its own opioids. That's very reassuring information.
Mm.
It's very empowering information. So it's helping to provoke those changes that are good for you. Now, when you learn about the nocebo effect, well, that is actually also very reassuring information because what you're telling people is that this pain that you're feeling is not inevitably a part of some kind of biological trigger, and that actually by changing your mindset, by maybe applying some of the thinking that's more common that's associated with the placebo effect, you can reduce that pain as well. You can actually bring about those physiological changes that could reduce that discomfort. So, in some ways, actually learning about the nocebo effect is essentially bringing about the same mindset shift that you have when you're learning about the placebo effect. It's just a different way of framing it, but you're still reassuring and empowering people and letting them know that they do have more control over what's happening in their bodies than they might think.
Now, in both of your books, you talk about individuals and you also talk about groups, right? So you talk about how individuals fall into this intelligence trap. And then you talk about how when you put all these intelligent people together, right, sometimes it can make group decision making even worse. And then you also talk in the expectation effect about things like mass psychogenic illness and how, individuals' perception of the world can be influenced, it can be contagious, right? And I'm guessing that your third book is building on both on those
Yeah.
insights. But there's a lot that can be learned about how to construct competent organizations based on these insights. And you reference a bunch of the classic examples like Deepwater Horizon and so forth. And one normally would think that if you throw a bunch of intelligent people together, you're going to get good results, but that's often not the case. In fact, sometimes I think you suggest that you looked at some data where you may want to have a couple people that are not rock stars in the group, and this might improve performance. So why is that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so this is something called the too much talent effect. And, you can see it in sport. So, I mean, I would say this, but it was meant to be, according to the studies, it was meant to be why the English football team, the English soccer team, are so terrible is because actually they've got too much talent within the team. But you can see it in
That's what they tell
whole
themselves.
bunch of
That's what the English tell themselves, right?
right. Yeah. I mean, but you can see it in like basketball, for example, or even in things like investment banks. If you look at the different teams, it's as you said, you have these kind of an optimal number of these kind of star figures, and then if you go over that, performance starts to drop. And the problem really seems to be that these people, their kind of rutting egos just destroy the team dynamic. So they're no longer cooperating in the optimal way. And often having a mix of different people with different qualities, not all of whom will be the high performers as individuals, but maybe they are really good at gelling the team together, getting people to communicate. That's what you really want, that whole mix of personalities. So in recruitment, it is important, obviously, to get people who are highly talented, but we shouldn't ignore those other skills. We should always be thinking of like, what are they going to provide to the group dynamic, not just what are they personally achieving as a single individual.
Yeah, but also I think you talk about how putting people with certain dispositions into a pool of people, that sometimes their dispositions are infectious, right? So, for instance, pessimistic people may make other people more pessimistic. Optimistic people may make other people more optimistic. So, I mean, it seems like putting together a group, it's kind of like, assembling a meal, and you have to, think about how the flavors are going to interact with each other, right?
Yeah. I mean, exactly. And so I think, you look at something like the phenomena that I discuss in the intelligence trap. And like, I think it's great to have someone who is like a real optimist and is always looking on the bright side and is always thinking big. But you do want not someone who is totally pessimistic and is always going to drag everyone down, but you want someone who's realistic and is asking those difficult questions. And they're going to say, well, you have these big dreams, but here are the 10 challenges that we're going to have to overcome before we get there. So you absolutely want to have those different perspectives. And teams full of one or the other would not work. Like if you have someone who's only looking at the challenges, they're going to be less ambitious and maybe produce more mediocre projects. If you have the people who are kind of blindly optimistic, well, they're going to overlook some really important challenge that is ultimately going to lead to failure unless you preempt it and plan for it. So yeah, that's why I think we can use other people to counter some of our own biases, and it's actually the process of discussion and conversation that is going to really help to do that.
Now, is there a way to measure what GQ, right? Group intelligence, right? Is there? I think you alluded to some of these methods that they use to evaluate kind of group performance, but is there a way to think about kind of group wisdom, or this practical wisdom, this practical form of intelligence, and if we want to get really good kind of wisdom in the group, do we require, is it better to have like a whole group of wise individuals and staple them together, or can you replicate group wisdom by having a bunch of people that aren't wise, but by having good processes to get that result?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, so there are these measures of collective intelligence by people like Anita Williams-Woolley, and like I think like her challenges were often, it was kind of modeled on the IQ test. So there were some kind of problem-solving tasks that people had to do as a group rather than individuals, but they had clear parallels with the IQ test. But there were other things where she was measuring, how were they cooperating? Like if you have multiple people all contributing to a Google Doc, is it like a free-for-all where people are deleting stuff as soon as someone else has written it, or are they coordinating effectively? And what she found was that, that is a really good predictor of performance in the workplace amongst these teams. And what the one predictor didn't seem to be the average IQ of the group, nor the highest IQ within the group, but it really was the social sensitivity of the individual members. So, how perceptive were they to other people's emotions, and how good were they at turn taking in conversation? Now, I would love to see some studies that extended that and also looked at these measures of wisdom and critical thinking that we spoke about. My perception is that actually, the more information we get, the better it would be. So if you had a team of people who are generally very good critical thinkers, I think that would be better than having a team with, lower than average critical thinking. But I still think the dynamics, that social element, would be fundamentally important. And I think that's because, even if individual members do have biases that maybe lower their critical thinking, if we are capable of having those good conversations where we can challenge each other's biases, that's more powerful overall than the measures of any one single person within the group, or even the average of the group as a whole.
Well, can you give us the elevator pitch for the new book? Why we should all go out
absolutely. Yeah, with pleasure. So it's called The Laws of Connection, and it presents 13 social strategies that will improve your life in various ways. Now, the foundation of this is the pretty much indisputable fact that social connection is fundamentally important for our health and longevity, but also things like creativity, security. And so we should want to feel more connected than many of us currently are. And then what I do is I identify the psychological barriers that prevent that from occurring, so that stand in the way of forming authentic, genuine, meaningful relationships. And I provide some evidence-based tips on how to overcome those barriers to form these social networks that we crave.
Well, I'm going to go check it out. In the meantime, I'm going to slap this one on my recommended reading list for my behavioral economics class. So thank you so much, David, for joining us, and look forward to chatting again. Okay.
Thank you. Me too. It's been a pleasure.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.